Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is tracking wolves, traditional skills for monitoring animals in the wild. And it will be presented by wildlife biologist Aaron Bott. Aaron, thank you so much for presenting to us today. I'm going to turn it right over to you. Let's get started.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining today. This is a topic that hopefully will be fun and also engaging. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right into it. A little bit about myself. I work as a biologist in the American West. My family has been here for the past 6 generations, and I'm deeply connected to the region out here, specifically the greater Yellowstone area, which is where I grew up. I have been affiliated with and worked with multiple government organizations and universities and non-government organizations. Currently, I'm a doctoral student doing my PhD on wolves in the American West at Utah State University. And today I'm going to be talking a lot about the work that I've done with Yellowstone National Park and their wolf project. I first began working with wolves for my master's degree, which I also did at Utah State University. And I worked specifically in the backcountry of Yellowstone, studying wolf spatial persistence and reproduction in a multi-jurisdictional landscape. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that's gonna really be the backbone of the setting for today's presentation. But I also get the opportunity to work as a biologist with lots of different animals, including lions, mountain lions, black bears, grizzly bears, moose, bighorn sheep, you name it. If we've got it here in North America, I've had the opportunity to work with it. So it's a pretty exciting career. And shamelessly, I'm going to say that today I am going to be referencing this book several times, written by Mark Elbrook, Mammal Tracks and Sign, A Guide to North American Species, was published in a second edition just a couple of years ago. And currently, this is probably the best and perhaps even a definitive field guide for anyone interested in studying animal signs, mammalian signs here in North America. And Dr. Elbrook has also written a couple of books and co-authored a couple of books on bird sign and tracks, and I think reptiles as well. It's a great book with contributions by Casey McFarland, who happens to be the husband of one of my lab mates at Utah State University. And yeah, I want to give credit where credit is due, but if you are interested in picking up a book, I'll mention this one again at the end of my presentation. This is a quote that I came across reading a fantastic book called The Tiger. And I want to share it with you because I think that it romantically and practically kind of wraps up exactly what tracking and studying animal sign really means to us in a primeval way. The first letter of the first word of the first recorded story was printed, not by us, but by an animal. Animals, in this way, you could say, taught us how to read. When we first evolved on the landscape, we learned how to find food by studying animal signs, by following tracks and learning and understanding what markings, no matter how subtle, what they mean and how we could best interpret them to our own advantage. And I like that idea, this notion that animal tracks are kind of a proto-alphabet that help us navigate the landscape. And when you're getting into tracking, that's kind of a great way to look on the sport or the event of tracking, because you're trying to interpret a story, and sometimes, especially when you're just beginning, it can be slow at first. I've got a young boy at home and we're working on reading right now, and he loves stories, but when it comes to actually reading the words and sounding out the letters that he sees printed on the page, he makes mistakes. And just like that, when we're out in the field tracking, we make mistakes. And it takes a lot of practice in order for someone to get good. And it also takes a lot of humility to admit when we're wrong. But the backdrop again of all of this, why we read animal sign, why we study animal tracks and scat and markings, is because it really has a deep root in our primeval past. We as a species have depended for millennia on reading the environment around us and understanding how animals move. Particularly when our ancestors were hunters and gatherers, we had to be able to recognize not only environmental signs, but animated signs created by animals so that we could know when migrations were happening, when calving or fawning was happening so that we could get more food. We had to understand which animals were dangerous in the area. And again, all of this really made or broke our ancestors. And unfortunately, in our modern world, not many people depend on this kind of knowledge anymore. They are illiterate when it comes to tracking wildlife. But fortunately, it's not super difficult. Just like studying reading and writing for the first time, it takes patience. But with persistence, you can get fairly decent at it. Yeah. Now, as a wildlife researcher, it's also important to recognize that we've come a long way in terms of our understanding of the environment and of ecology. And this is a good thing because it's helped us gain a broader understanding of the natural world. In the 1960s, it was really the twin brothers, Frank and John Craighead, working out of the Yellowstone ecosystem, that first developed tracking collars. To begin with, they were radio telemetry collars. And in many ways, the science has not, or the technology has not advanced substantially in our wildlife field to date. But the Craigheads pioneered radio telemetry and tracking collar science by first doing work with carnivores in the Yellowstone ecosystem. Specifically, they did a lot of groundbreaking research on grizzly bears. I've given a number of webinar presentations, and one of them is on grizzly bears in the Yellowstone ecosystem. I actually think a couple of them are on Yellowstone grizzly bears. And I talk a lot about the Craigheads and celebrate them a little bit there, but they're remarkable biologists that really advanced our understanding of ecology. And we're still using those same kind of methods today. It was right after World War II when a lot of our technological advancements started to come home from that war, and we began to employ them in natural history research and wildlife ecology research. And even today, we're still using, like I said, a lot of the same basic methods for monitoring our wildlife populations. This is me working up a couple of wolves in Wyoming last year, and you can see that we're still putting out tracking collars on these individuals to help us understand their movements. The technology that we have is really important. Radio telemetry is a little bit antiquated, but we still use it a lot on lots of different species of wildlife. We put out these tracking devices on everything from beavers to turtles to snakes to wolves to wolverines to lions. And with an antenna, and a receiver, we're able to listen and locate the proximity of where animals are at, and then using a mathematical process known as triangulation, we're able to get a rough idea of where exactly each individual is at any given time when we're out in the field. And this is important because no matter how good you are as a tracker, you can't always be where animals are at. And sometimes you need to find specific animals for certain reasons, whether it's because of the information you're trying to get from their reproduction and you need to locate their den, or if you're looking for particular mating patterns or aggressive rutting patterns, again, telemetry can really help you out. The technology has advanced where we also have collars with satellites that can help us out. We have GPS collars now that we're able to put on wildlife, and those are becoming more and more affordable, and therefore we're using them more and more often. And so after capturing an animal, you put one of these collars on it, you might insert a pit tag, and then you can look at your computer screen rather than having to go out in the field and try and locate the animal with an antenna and a receiver. You're able just to watch your monitor and see where the animal moves, which again really helps us to understand how wildlife utilize their landscapes. And animals do move. Before we started putting collars to monitor wildlife, we did not actually understand that wildlife moved as much as they did. And I talk a little bit about this with the craigheads in my grizzly bear webinar, but prior to the craigheads studying animals with collars on them, we really thought that the 2.2 million acres of Yellowstone National Park was a sufficient area to be habitat, sustainable habitat for grizzly bears and for elk and for wolves and for everything else that we have in that area of the world. But once we started putting collars on these animals, we quickly realized that animals move and they require ecosystems rather than just arbitrary boxes that humans draw in the landscape and create national parks or national wildlife refuges. So ecosystems have become really important in our efforts to conserve wildlife species within the last 70 years. And it's really because we began to understand just how important the entirety of the ecosystem is, more than just postage stamp conservation regions that we humans create. I know that sounds so obvious to us now, but that really was groundbreaking back in the 1960s and in the 1970s. And this map here shows a migration routes of a lot of ungulates or hoofed animal species around the Yellowstone ecosystem, showing how they move in and out of the park. They're centrally located in this map. And it's now obvious to us, again, because of our advanced technology, that animals require a lot of space. And we would not have known this really if it hadn't been for our technological advancements. Now, I spent a moment with this presentation talking about the technology that we use today that is commonly used in wildlife research. And if you're listening to this presentation and thinking, I thought this was going to be about tracking and traditional methods of monitoring wildlife on the landscape, what is this guy talking about? He's spending a lot of time on technology. Well, don't worry, I hear you, and we're about to leave technology behind, because I'm going to talk about some of the drawbacks to using this technology. When we put pit tags in animals, when we put radio collars or GPS collars on wildlife, it requires a lot of effort. And we call this invasive wildlife monitoring. Contrasting that, we have non-invasive wildlife monitoring or non-invasive wildlife studies, which is traditional tracking, where you don't actually handle the animal, where you don't have to put a collar on the animal. And as I hope I've made it clear, there's a lot of advantages, necessary advantages to invasive wildlife research. But there's some big drawbacks too. Perhaps the biggest drawback is safety. In order to catch wildlife, we are putting people and the wildlife at risk. Sometimes accidents happen. Just a couple weeks ago, I guess about a month ago, we were out doing captures and our helicopter crashed. And fortunately, no one was hurt, but that could have been a horrific accident. And we were out trying to capture mountain goats, putting collars on them to study their movements in an alpine ecosystem, something that we need to do because we're not out monitoring the goats in the field. Goats are often in places where the snows are too deep and the terrain is too difficult for us to go out and track them. But yeah, while we were out and about, the helicopter crashed and people could have died. So helicopters and planes, they can crash. And not only that, but they're also extremely expensive when we're going out and about and we're surveying wolves. I think it's about $1,200 to $1,300 an hour to pay for the fuel of the helicopter or the plane, depending on what we're using up in the air. So very expensive. And it's also dangerous for the animals too, because as you can imagine, we do everything we possibly can to ensure the safety and the welfare of the animal is one of our top priorities. But again, accidents can happen and things can go wrong, and an animal can break its leg or break its neck. And we just have to be really careful of that. And we also have to be mindful of that. So these are costly and dangerous things that sometimes, because of our limited amount of technology as of right now, we sometimes are required to pursue in order to better understand the wildlife that we have on the landscape and their movements and the conservation needs that they might have. Now, with non-invasive research, things can be cheaper and they can be safer, both for the people and for the wildlife. But again, as I already mentioned, wildlife tracking is, it takes some skill and it takes some time and it takes some humility to truly begin to appreciate and develop a knack for it. And to study wildlife, you need to put on your sleuth cap, just like Sherlock Holmes, and you need to depend on a lot of deduction. And this is important because, unlike in the movies, tracking wildlife and studying animal markings and signs takes a lot of patience. And the longer you are in coming to conclusions, the more likely you are to come to the correct conclusions. The number one thing that helps you learn the most when you're out studying animal sign is making mistakes. And boy, howdy, I've made mistakes. The most common are when you jump to conclusions too quickly and you put your foot in your mouth by thinking that you read a sign one way and you later find out that actually you read it wrong. And then you have to go back and rewrite your narrative as the clues start coming together and you're piecing together a story. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what is required for a non-invasive study of wolves to traditionally track them out in the wild, and also talk about some other wildlife that we might encounter out in the area where I've been studying wolves. I'm not going to go into all the details of track sizes, foot measurements, gaits, trots. I'm not going to go into all those details because you'll forget them, and it's easier just to look them up in a book. There's a lot of great reference books out there, which you're going to need if you decide to pick up tracking in your own backyard. So really, I hope today to cover just the broad basics and give you a general understanding of what we're looking for when we go out into the wild. One of the first things we're looking for is, or one of the first things we need to consider is what animals we have in the area that we are doing our research. It does not make sense for me to be looking for collared peccaries in the Yellowstone ecosystem. Or if I come across a track and I don't know what it is, it's not very practical for me to think that it might be a jaguar if I'm in the Tetons, if I'm in northwestern Wyoming. And by deduction, we can really make a lot of progress. So if you're in Maine or Texas or California or Alaska right now and you're listening to this and you want to start tracking in your backyard, it really is advantageous for you to perhaps get a field guide first and learn about what you actually have in your backyard and what it is most likely that you will encounter. Now, animals do move, and we have seen stories or read stories and heard reports about animals that make great and wild dispersals across the landscape, and they show up in uncanny places. So like in any experiment, we can't rule out the possibility that there might not be a jaguar on the loose in Yellowstone, but it's highly unlikely. It's not probable that we're going to encounter a jaguar. So that helps us deduce what other types of felids might be on the landscape. Um, Likewise, this here is a print of a grizzly bear, and I've got tracks there on the left-hand side, or excuse me, on the right-hand side of your screen that show us some of the definitive um, characteristics of a grizzly bear gait and a grizzly bear track. Now, I know that when I'm in Yellowstone, I'm not going to encounter a polar bear. I also know that there are 3 species of bear in North America. So without the polar bear, that leaves the grizzly bear or the black bear. And fortunately for me, when I came across this track, I had already done my homework. I knew that Yellowstone had grizzly bears and it also had black bears. And so in looking at the size of this track, I know from the measurements that I'm familiar with that this is most likely a grizzly bear track. But aside from that, there are a couple of characteristics, and I'm going to quickly jump back and forth between these 2 slides here, of black bear tracks and grizzly bear tracks. So this is probably a 1/4 mile away from where this photo was taken. But black bears and grizzly bears overlap in the same home range very frequently in the Yellowstone ecosystem. But, and I apologize because you can't see it very well here, typically black bear paws have toes that wrap around their metatarsal and metacarpal pads, the main pads that we kind of call the palm, if you will. And the most indicative feature of both grizzly bears and black bears by sight or by track is not their color, as many of you probably know. There's a lot of brown black bears out there, and there's some pretty dark grizzly bears. And it's not their hump. The hump is a characteristic of the grizzly bear, but sometimes it can be very tricky to be sure if a young grizzly bear has a hump or not. The most definitive way of determining what is a black bear versus a grizzly bear are the claws. You can see here in the grizzly bear track that the claws are really long. Those claws are used for digging up roots and tubers and digging up rodents. The grizzly bear evolved out in the open where they had to use those long claws for digging, just like a badger. Whereas it's assumed that black bears evolved in dense timbered ecosystems. So they've got short claws that help them climb trees. So when I'm looking at tracks, not only am I looking at the prints of their digits to see if they wrap around the pad, their metatarsal or metacarpal pad, but I'm also looking for those fine, detailed prints that come from the claws. And in this case, the grizzly bear is pretty obvious, and the black bear is also pretty obvious, fortunately, because again, in the black bear's case, the bear was walking through mud. Now, other things to consider when you're out tracking is you might not find tracks, but you might find other signs. This you can see in the brush underneath this pinyon pine tree. There is a tracking collar. And I found this tracking collar because I was looking for it, except I was hoping to find a bighorn sheep attached to it. But instead, I found a cache where a mountain lion had killed the bighorn sheep and stashed its body. Now, when I first got to this, I wanted to know what was the cause of mortality of the bighorn sheep. And because of my environment, I knew that there weren't grizzly bears or wolves in this area, but we have other things that might kill sheep, such as coyotes or bobcats even, if the sheep is young. But in this case, I knew right away that it was a mountain lion or a cougar that made the kill, because cougars, like most cats, tend to stash or bury their carcasses. They do this because cats are not very aggressive when it comes to defending their kills. They're more efficient at killing their prey than bears and canids are, but they're not very good at defending them. So oftentimes you have what's called kleptoparasitism, where a wolf or a bear comes in and will steal the kill of a mountain lion. And so in order to reduce scavenging by other mouths on the landscape, lions will often bury or stash their kills up in branches where other predators might not be able to get to it as easily. And here is a photo of a mountain lion track. Mountain lions have large feet. They kind of overlap in size with that of a wolf. And in Yellowstone, it's difficult to tell sometimes by size alone what is a lion versus what is a wolf track. However, there's some major characteristics that really help us know very quickly the difference between felid tracks and canine tracks. I tried to outline the felid track here, this mountain lion track, but as we should know, cats have retractable claws. And so when they walk, one of the simplest ways of knowing whether it's a dog or a cat is to look for claw prints if you can. Cheetahs, I'm pretty sure cheetahs are the only cat species that do not have retractable claws, and that's because they obviously need them for running fast. They need to use them like cleats. But mountain lions also have a distinct shape. Like wolves, they have this fused pad that creates kind of the palm of their foot, but the track itself is more of a U-shaped rather than an X or even an H shape, and I'll show you in a minute what I mean by that. But here you can see, I'll highlight them. These are some lion tracks where a lion went down to some water in the desert to get a drink. But I'm going to leave cats and bears behind for a minute, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what I do in Yellowstone working for the Yellowstone Wolf Project as someone who tracks wolves. And to help you understand, I'm going to give you a little bit of background regarding what my master's degree was on. So I did my master's on wolves in Yellowstone's interior. If you haven't been to Yellowstone, you still might know that Yellowstone is famous for its wolf sightings. But what you might not know is that the majority of the wolf sightings take place in the northeastern corner of Yellowstone, in Lamar Valley, where there is a big open montane valley, which has a road conveniently going right through it. So a lot of people get to see wolves. But this area is only 10% of Yellowstone. The rest of Yellowstone is a vast timbered forest. And this is particularly the area where I grew up and also where I did my graduate research. And one of the questions that we had, or the Park Service had, was, are there wolves in the southwestern corner of Yellowstone? We knew that there had been because once upon a time, back in 2002, there was a collared wolf that dispersed and settled in southwestern Yellowstone, but that wolf had since died and they had not been able to collar any wolves since. And so without any collared wolves, we wanted to know if there was spatial persistence of wolves on the landscape and if they were reproducing and what their reproduction rates were like. So to give you a little bit of a background about the natural history of the wolf, it's important to understand that these animals are famous for walking. That is the superpower of the wolf. I've given some webinars on wolf biology, and you can check those out if you're interested in learning more. But for now, all you really need to know is that wolves walk. They have huge areas that they can cover, even in a day, 20 to 40 miles if necessary. But they're constantly on the move. And so how was I going to find out if wolves were in the backcountry without any marked wolves, without any collared wolves to help me? Well, to begin with, you have to be comfortable with hiking, or in some cases, horseback riding. So I spent a lot of time hiking in the backcountry, and I believe my first year I hiked, I think about 500 miles in 6 months, tracking wolves, and I didn't know where to begin. So it took a long time to find out where wolves would be and where their haunts would be. And fortunately, I was able to find sign of them. And from there, you start to use your deduction skills to determine what is what in the backcountry. I was in the heart of Yellowstone, and wolves they're famous for having huge feet, huge feet. Their tracks are generally on average between 4 to 5 inches long, which is pretty substantial. I have a German Shepherd, which is a big dog, and her tracks, even though she is a big dog, and German Shepherds in size and in body weight can overlap with a wolf's body weight. On average, wolves are about 100 pounds. Her feet are nowhere near the size of a wolf's. But just to say that you have a track and it looks like a wolf or it looks like a dog doesn't mean that you should very quickly rule out that it was a wolf or it was a dog, because their feet size can overlap, and there are some very big dogs out there with huge feet. And also, depending on the time of year, you might have young wolves that have smaller feet. And so again, utilizing deduction, this is basic like 101 tracking. I knew that where I was, I had either a very large dog or I had a wolf track. Coyote tracks are much smaller and fox tracks are much smaller. But I will say this, coyotes have big feet too. And it can surprise you how large their feet are. And until you compare them with the size of a wolf track, you might mistakenly think that you are looking at a small wolf, perhaps. But once you begin to identify wolves versus coyotes, and you do it frequently enough, it becomes almost second nature to look at a track and be able to identify quickly. So again, here I am in the backcountry, and I know that this is not a coyote track, and that there are no large dogs in the backcountry of Yellowstone because of multiple reasons, but the first and foremost is it's illegal. And then adding up several other signs, I know that I'm on the track of some wolves. And again, I mentioned that more than just tracking, looking at tracks, you also need to be able to discern other characteristics on the landscape to help you study animal behavior and animal life histories on the landscape. And this involves, in the case of tracking, learning about size and also learning about the sex of the animal that you're studying. So most mammals, and wolves are included in this, have sexual dimorphism, which means that one sex is larger than the other sex. And this can help you, especially when you're looking at a group of wolf tracks, in determining which ones are the adults, which ones are the juvenile wolves or the pups, and even it might help you determine which sex is which sex when looking at the entirety of the wolf pack. That can be very helpful. And with bears as well, because bears typically have quite a lot of sexual dimorphism. But humility boils down to everything. And sometimes you might jump to the wrong conclusion. I've done that before, where you think that you can identify something, such as the sex of the animal, but then you turn out to be wrong. Because just like with humans, there's no rule that says all males are this size, all females are this size. There's a lot of overlap, and that goes with a lot of other things too. I also showed you here on this slide that you can learn to register the trot or the gaits of the animals that you're studying, depending on the activity of the wolf, whether it's trotting, whether it's running, whether it's doing a side lope or a direct lope. You can begin to understand what the animal is doing and how quickly it was moving on the landscape. And also very importantly, and we do this when we're doing invasive studies too, and we actually have the animal in the hand, it's really important to become familiar with animal tooth wear, because your teeth, that is how you can determine how old an animal is. As biologists, if you want to know exactly how an animal is, we have to take a tooth out of the mouth. So it works best when your animal is dead, and you can pop a tooth out and you send it to the lab, and we do a cross-cut section of a certain tooth depending on the species. With a canine, it would be one of the canine teeth, and you actually have annual ring growths, just like on a tree, for animals that live in temperate ecosystems, like our wolves do. And you can count to be certain how old your individual wolf was. But if I am trying to determine from a wolf skull I find out in the field or from a wolf that I have in the hand, just how old the individual is, I need to really guesstimate pretty good based on tooth wear. And of course, just like everything else, you can't be totally certain how old your wolf is. Just because it's carnassial might be very low, close to the gum line. That doesn't necessarily mean you have a very old wolf. Perhaps it had a freak accident and it broke its tooth when it was eating a bone a couple of years ago. So you might have a 6-year-old wolf and it looks like it's got 10-year-old teeth, for example. But by looking at other signs, other physical characteristics of the individual, you can figure out things pretty quickly. This is what I was talking about earlier with the shape of wolf prints specifically, but this can be applied to any other variety of species. So canines and felines are species that we lump them together as digitigrade animals, which means that they walk basically on their toes. Humans are what we call plantigrade. Bears are plantigrade as well. In fact, mammals evolved as plantigrade species, but over millennia and through evolution, we now have a lot of different foot characteristics out there. And typically with animals like a lot of your weasels, your otters, your bears that have big, heavier hips and pelvises and a lot of meat and fat stored on their rear end, their hind feet are going to be larger. But for canines and felids, generally their front feet are going to be larger because they have to support more weight, the weight of the chest and all of its internal organs, as well as its head and neck. So you can see here from this illustration that the front foot of the wolf is significantly larger than the hind foot, which helps you to identify which foot is going first and also identify what the movements of the animal are. And you can see here, I kind of skipped over it a couple slides ago, but again, we look for that characteristic X or that H to really help us define the shape of a wolf paw print. We also have this very indicative diamond shape that you can see on my picture, my photograph, where the tips of the toes kind of come together and then it recedes back there at the metacarpal pad. Wolves do have a dew claw on their front feet. They don't have it on their hind feet, typically. Now this is definitely not the sexiest part of what I do, but it is one of the most common things. I go out and I collect scat. So scat is just a fancy word for fecal matter, excuse me, for animal poop that's on the landscape. And this stuff, although again, it doesn't sound very sexy or appealing, this stuff is like gold out in the field because you can learn a lot from what you find. Fecal material can help us understand what the animal's eating, what it's been preying on, what portion of its meal was most recently consumed. If it's oily and black and liquidy, that means that there's a lot of protein and meat that quickly passes through and is more easily digested than things like bone and hair, which on the right, you're finding more of that in the stool of this wolf. Canines and felids have different types of stool, and without getting into the gross details, I'll say right now that typically wolves, their stools almost spiral, especially when there's a lot of hair in them. They spiral almost like rope, and they come out tapered on the end. Now, wolf scat looks very different from domestic dog scat, and that's because the diet is substantially different. So domestic dogs have within them an enzyme known as AMY 2B. Wow, I can't believe I remembered the name of that. AMY2B is an enzyme that domestic dogs have developed through artificial selection and living with humans, and that helps them to digest starches in a way that wild canines cannot digest them. So if you have, like myself, a German Shepherd at home and you got to go out and pick up the dog poop, it looks very different than what you typically find with wolves and with coyotes. Yeah, this stuff is also really important because not only does it tell us what the diet of the animal is, but in some cases it can determine the boundary of territories or significant landmarks. Wolves, just like all canids, they mark trails, they mark elevated surfaces. They have interdigital glands that help them scent mark with their feet. Sometimes you'll see that scraping after your dog goes to the bathroom. But also they have anal sac glands that we don't really understand how they help communicate among other wolves, but we do know that they are used, and of course urination is very important as well. And urine can tell us a lot. With wolves, you have dual urination periods between breeding pairs, so it's almost like showing off a wedding ring in a weird way. But if you want to know who the breeding pair is in the wolves that you're observing, you look for that patterned and repetitive urination for scent marking. So if the male urinates, then the female goes and urinates right on top of that same spot, or vice versa. This is a dead wolf that I came across and had to do a field necropsy on. Field necropsy. A necropsy is just a fancy word like an autopsy, but typically it's done on wildlife. And this is a great case in point of looking at the teeth to see the wear of how old this particular wolf was. And I should say right now, and I apologize for forgetting to mention this earlier, I do have a couple slides of some dead animals in this, but they're not very graphic. So I'm sorry I didn't mention that earlier, but be forewarned. But looking at this wolf's teeth, I very quickly can tell that there's not a lot of staining, there's not a lot of wear. This wolf is probably less than a year old. And after decapitating it and sending it off to a lab where there was further and more accurate methods for determining the cause of death of this particular individual and its age, it was confirmed that, of course, this was indeed a less than a year old wolf. Many times when you're looking to determine the cause of death, it's very important for you to do necropsies, which is taking measurements and also carefully looking at what possibly could have caused the animal's death. And in many cases, it could be disease, which is something that you always have to be cautious of when you're doing your research. I didn't mention this earlier as well. I should hope that it's obvious, but you never want to handle fecal matter of any, especially any carnivore, because the things that you can get from it, disease-wise, parasite-wise, are atrocious. So if you're out doing research, make sure you're wearing your gloves whenever you're handling fecal matter. This here was an elk that was a bull elk that had been killed by wolves, and I was able to come across it, did a field necropsy. You can see that the nubs of the antlers, where the antlers had been growing, were all chewed off. Very frequently, wolves have common patterns of predation that help you determine how they killed and how they hunted. And this is important when we're looking at livestock and the cause of death for livestock, determining whether it was a lion, a coyote, a wolf, a bear, or whatever, or disease, and then the carnivores came afterwards and scavenged off of it. It takes a lot of deduction, and sometimes you have to be there pretty quick in order to make accurate deductions and evaluate what actually happened. For that case, I'll say that it's a law in most Western states that if you are a livestock owner and you need to get livestock predation confirmed in order to be compensated monetarily for the depredation that has occurred, someone from a representative from the government agency, a wildlife biologist, has to be out there within 72 hours in order for you to receive that compensation. Because after that, it becomes too difficult to tell. But this is a pack of wolves that killed this elk. Wolves typically pursue their animals and bite behind the armpits. They start feeding back near the pelvis, on the side of the animal, near the groin. They typically open up the body cavity that way. Wolves are also notorious for chewing off the noses of most of their prey. So they'll typically eat the faces and the noses of most of their prey, but they don't typically crack open the cranium and eat the brains. I only bring up that grotesque detail because bears and mountain lions often do that. So that can help you again deduce what killed the animal and what was feeding on the animal. On the upper left-hand corner, that's a beaver that was killed by wolves. I frequently found sandhill cranes and beavers in the diet of wolves. Deer, especially deer fawns, were consumed whole, where even the bones are eaten by the wolves and nothing is left behind, which makes it difficult for us to truly understand the complete diet of these animals unless there's not direct observation. And again, looking at tooth wear, you're trying to determine the age of the animals that are being killed and what was their state of health. And if you can, whenever possible, cracking open the bones really helps you understand more than anything else about the body condition of the prey, or in some cases, the predator. The upper left-hand corner is the femur of a wolf, and I'm looking to see what its body condition was like. And in the right-hand side, that's an elk femur. The femur is probably the best place to get your marrow, just because it's a large bone, and the the overall condition of the animal is most accurately reflected in the marrow. If you're looking, and this is an example taken from a book that I'll credit at the end, but the bottom left-hand corner shows good femur quality. It should be kind of like a pale pink. That's what you want your marrow color to look like. That indicates that you're healthy and well. On the right-hand side, you can see that the marrow is a little bit pink. This is to be expected. There's nothing alarming here with this elk. This was in May, which in Yellowstone is early spring, so there hasn't been a lot of green up yet, and the elk is not going to be in its prime condition. But it's not super comforting. Marrow gets really bad if it starts to look gooey and almost like snot, very mucusy. And you know that your animal was on its way out the door. It had 2 or 3 feet in the grave before your predator ever got there. You can also look for other signs. This is where wolves bedded down. In long grass, if you start getting really good at reading animal sign, you don't need mud or snow to figure out how to read where animals are at. I have been doing this long enough that I can pretty accurately walk through long grass, through meadows like this, and I can track wolves for miles and know that it's wolves that I'm following because of their gait and their lope as they jump through this grass. And in some cases, animals can lead you to their dens. So these are two, at this time, the photos were taken, to abandoned dens of wolves. You can see the one on the right actually had wolf tracks from a recent visit to the wolves coming into their area. But den sites for any species are really important in helping us understand, again, their reproduction and their overall natural history. And I'm going to wrap up by segueing into this and saying that today we actually have a lot of remote tracking technology. It's not quite the same, I understand, but for a lot of my research, I'll, for example, come to a den site and I'll put out these remote cameras, these trail cameras, they're often called. This photograph I have of the one on this side, or on this slide, was chewed up pretty good by a black bear, but it was the only camera that I had a photograph of to share with you on this slide. But these cameras are fantastic, and they really have opened up the world of non-invasive research because they give us the ability to observe and even document reproduction, occupancy, and in some cases behavioral patterns that we would otherwise not be privy to. This is a photograph of the wolves that I was tracking for my master's degree, taken actually as a video, but unfortunately I'm not really able to share videos through this webinar presentation, but a lot of the stuff that I get is videos that helps me, again, not only understand the species I'm interested in this case wolves, but it also helps me document what other animals are out in the field, which I failed to mention. But I need to know what other animals are in the environment. What is my species of interest interacting with? And that can really come into play because as I'm going out and about and I'm doing my studies, again, I am not just looking at wolf tracks. I'm looking at grizzly bear tracks and black bear tracks and moose and elk and deer and beavers and otters and coyotes and fox and everything else. And the more you do this, the more fun it gets, and the more reliable and I guess independent you become when it comes to tracking. Tracking is something that I depend on greatly, and again, it's perhaps our oldest science. It's definitely our oldest method of literacy, and it helps us to understand the real world around us, the natural world around us. And in conclusion, I'll recommend a couple of books out there, 3 books. These ones have been helpful for me, but there are dozens and dozens and dozens of books out there to help you identify tracks and scat and animal sign. These are some that I referenced today, and I really do like Mark Elbrook's Mammal Tracks and Sign book. If you're in North America, it's very thorough. And most importantly, it takes experience, right? Because a photograph doesn't really help you understand everything that animal's doing. So getting out and learning and making mistakes and taking plenty of time to try and read your environment is what counts most. And with that, I'll say thank you and take any questions.
Aaron, thank you. That was fabulous. I want to remind everyone that they can submit questions via the questions field in the control panel, but we've already got some really great questions. So let me just jump in. The books were great references. Thank you so much for sharing those. But in this modern day, is there an app that helps you identify tracks that you could recommend? Or maybe that's your next project?
Maybe, I'm sure there is. I know that there are, and I know this because I was looking for a gardening app last night. I know that there's a lot of apps out there that help you with plant identification. And I'm sure there are some out there that help you with animal identification. Although I'm pretty leery of taking a picture and using artificial intelligence to identify everything, just because I know that sometimes that doesn't always work out. But I would first and foremost recommend iNaturalist. I think that National Geographic is one of the primary owners of that. But the reason why I recommend iNaturalist is because it is a really important app in the community citizen science world. So if you want to participate in documenting what kind of animals, what kind of plants are around you, what kind of insects are around you, iNaturalist is the way to go. It's free, you can take pictures, and everything that you submit, at least if it's maybe interesting or a little bit bizarre, it gets validated by biologists and researchers that go in and make sure that all the information in there is being accurately identified, and what is claimed is actually what is.
Very cool. iNaturalist. Excellent. Okay, next question. Will a diseased animal cause harm to a predator?
I assume that the question is referring to if an animal that is diseased is consumed by a predator.
That is the way
disease,
I too, yeah.
Yeah. What if that animal will make it sick or not? Generally, no. Things like, I'm trying to think of the most common diseases that we have out here, such as like chronic wasting disease, which is pretty scary, and brucellosis, and mycoplasmas like pneumonias. Those are some of the bigger, more common diseases that affect ungulates or herbivores. But there's a lot of microbial barriers between the pathogens that transfer from one species to the next. And carnivores have evolved to consuming a lot of very rancid things. But that is another reason to emphasize why it's dangerous for us to handle carnivores because they do have a lot of nasty bugs that we definitely don't want to get or risk getting. So whenever you're out studying carnivores, you got to be very careful. But no, in most cases, there are parasites that can be transferred from ungulates, from herbivores that are consumed by predators, like hydated cysts and stuff like that, little worms that can go from one to the other, but nothing super fatal like CWD.
Okay, switching gears, are you alone when you track wolves? And if so, do you carry a gun? Have you ever had to use it?
Yeah, it depends on my project. Honestly, yes, I do go alone sometimes. That is not smart or safe, and I would never suggest that anyone does that. But unfortunately, I've in some cases had to do that, especially during COVID, when in the beginning phases of 2020 where we weren't supposed to be with anyone. I did a lot of field research by myself. If you want to be safe in wildlife country, especially grizzly bear country, you should have a group of people go. For my research, I never take more than one other person, and that's because I don't want to disturb the animals that I'm trying to research. Bear spray is great because it works on everything, not just bears. It works on people, it works on moose, it works on mountain lions, it works on wolves. It's fantastic. Depending on who I'm working with and what agency, I also do carry a revolver, depending on, again, my work. Guns are not to be trusted when you're doing backcountry field work, just because I think they create a false sense of security. It's almost impossible to really stop a charging grizzly bear with a revolver. I have a 44 Magnum, which is really the only caliber that could do any good. But some agencies require me to have it, and sometimes it's great because at the very least, it makes a big noise, and sometimes that noise can help save your life just by firing it in the air.
Is it okay for citizens to put up a trail camera, or do you need permission? I imagine that varies wildly depending on where you are.
Yeah, it does vary, but in most cases, it's totally fine. You have to know where you're at, but I'm assuming like you're in national forest lands or BLM lands or etc. In national parks, you have to have a research permit generally. But if you're on other public lands, it's typically not illegal, although you have to be careful because there are some regulations. For example, the state of Utah they just created a season for trail cameras. They're banned for hunting activities from I think it's like the end of July through December. You can't have cameras out in the field. But if you're not using them for hunting, there's some leeway there. So just check with your local area, your agency, whoever you're trying to work with.
Well, that's the last question we have time for today. So I'll hand it back to you for closing comments.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Again, I mostly just wanted to introduce you into non-invasive ways of studying wildlife and share with you how cool it is that we're still using traditional methods to help us understand the natural world. And this is a skill set that you can pick up at home. You can track your dog. You can track squirrels and blue jays or whatever you have in your own backyard. It doesn't just have to be wolves, but this type of activity is not only interesting and helpful scientifically, but it's also a great hobby. And I encourage you to get into it wherever you're at.
Thank you so much, Aaron. That was fascinating. I also want to thank everybody who tuned in. Please join us again tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I'll conclude the webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.